What's up, everybody? Today I want to talk about solid valve trains. Let's talk about Lash, why it's important, and how to set it. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I'm going to do my best to keep this one, I don't want to say short and sweet, but to the point. So, what is Valvetrain Lash, and why are we even talking about it? Well, a lot of common valve trains, especially in the world that a lot of the stuff that I work on is geared towards, are hydraulic lash adjusted valve trains. So, hydraulic lash adjusted just means that there is a plunger basically that based on a column of oil or a volume of oil that fills underneath the push rod, it takes up all the slack in the valve train. And so whenever you assemble your valve train, you do it with something called preload, where you're actually taking the length of the push rod and getting it long enough so that it depresses the plunger inside of the lifter just a little bit. That way that plunger has travel top and bottom to adjust all the lash out whenever the engine's running. And it puts a little bit of pressure on the push rod and rocker arm, and basically you're in contact at all times with the rocker arm to the valve tip. So that method works really good, and the main reason that you want to deal with that is it adds some complexity, sure, but it also makes it where you can start your car whenever it's 30 degrees outside or it's 70 degrees outside, and the engine can warm up to operating temperature, and you can have an aluminum block and an iron block, or you can have aluminum heads or iron heads and any mix of vice versa. And basically it handles all the thermal expansion that goes on with a typical street engine. It's something that is really a technology that's more meant to be OE based and meant to be used for making your life easy, honestly. But the way that things have kind of gone the past 20-ish years, maybe even a little longer than that, people have been working really hard trying to make hydraulic valve trains to be very stable at high RPM, where solid valve trains, they lend themselves to being a little more stable at high RPM with a little less effort, let's put it that way. Part of the reason for that is with a solid valve train, you can run a lot more valve spring without really seeing some ill effects within reason. If you go crazy with that, obviously those rules don't apply, but typically on a, let's just go through some examples. On a hydraulic setup, you're going to see something around 400 pounds open for a typical LS application. If you go a little higher, more aggressive LS application, maybe it's 450 or 480. A really aggressive LS application, this goes for other stuff too, small block Chevys and Fords and whatever and whatnot. A really aggressive kind of setup for that on a hydraulic setup, if you're pushing 500 pounds open, you're actually asking a lot out of that system, because those lobes are not designed to go that fast. The lifters are not designed to handle that kind of load, especially when you're really putting a ton of force into the system whenever you're trying to turn a lot of high RPM because of inertia. So when you get into the solid stuff, now you're talking about 6, 7, 8, 9, 1,000, 1,200 pounds worth of spring in some applications that really are not that crazy to see that kind of load. Yeah, it's a lot of stress on your parts when you go up there and do that stuff, but sometimes it's required. If, say, you got a big block Chevy and it's got a really heavy valve, and let's say you're doing, boost stuff, so you got to run some kind of steel or Inconel exhaust valve in that situation, and so in order to turn the really high RPM and do it with really heavy components, you got to have a lot of spring, and so therefore your stuff ends up being pretty crazy when you really get down and think about it. So that all said, I want to talk about solid stuff today. This goes for solid roller or solid, flat tappet, if you want to call it that. A lot of people aren't running that stuff anymore, but if this applies to your old school stuff, if that's what you got, then the same rules here still kind of apply. The flat tappet stuff is going to take a lot less spring, more in the realm of the hydraulic world, but it still is going to apply to what we're talking about today on at least how to set your lash. So I have my personal engine here behind me that is going to be going in a play toy here soon, and I'm doing another bigger, longer video on it, but I wanted to go ahead and take a minute and talk about that engine today. So that's why we have Lash. What exactly is Lash? Well, Lash is the wiggle. Maybe you can hear this. Hear that clicking? So I'm going to bring the camera in so you can see a little more of what I'm talking about here. But what this actually means is there's slop in the system. There's actually a gap between the rocker tip and the tip of the valve. And the reason for that is exactly what we talked about earlier, that thermal expansion that happens. Well, in my case, if I don't have that hydraulic lash adjuster in order to constantly maintain perfect load on that system, well, I've got to give it some room to grow, right? Well, that's exactly what we have here. I'm going to pull the camera in tight, and we're going to talk about exactly what it is and how to set it, because that's really what you need to know. Okay, so I'm set up here on my engine, and here's that wiggle that I was talking about. Let's see if I can get my hand out of the way here. This thing has actually got a gap between the tip of the rocker and the tip of the valve. And you have to have that in order to allow the thing to have room to grow. So the way that this actually gets set is not quite as simple as you might think, but it's also not hard at all. The way you want to think about this is you have to set the lash for whatever lobe you're working on whenever it's on the base circle. And the most important thing is to make sure 110% you're on the base circle. And the reason is because if you are just slightly off and you're starting to get into a little bit of lift, you'll set the lash, but when you come back to the base circle later, you're going to have excessive lash. You're going to have an excessive gap here because you set it in the wrong spot. Well, what's the big deal about that? The big deal is when this thing comes down at a lot of RPM and it hits the tip of that valve, you might as well just hit the thing with a hammer. It causes all sorts of bad news to start happening through your entire valvetrain system, from pushrod deflection to the rocker deflecting, from the spring getting a surge in it that you don't want to have because springs get angry whenever they get impacted. And it can cause a lot of problems whenever you're just trying to turn a bunch of RPM and do cool stuff with your friends, right? So what's the important thing here? We got to find the base circle. And a lot of people I've seen over the years, and I was one of them for a little while, and I learned really quickly that you can't just roll it around to TDC on compression. A lot of people think that you can just roll it to number one, and then they're both going to be up, and it's fine. And it's going to work in a lot of cases. The problem is it's not going to work in every case. When you start getting into some real serious camshaft and some serious engines, you really could run into the situation where you're getting ready to get yourself in trouble. You're going to be setting in the wrong place. So what's the rule? In my brain, it's EOIC. Exhaust opening, you adjust the intake. Intake closing, you adjust the exhaust. What exactly does that mean? Well, let's roll through here. I'm going to roll the engine over, and I'm just going to bar the engine over until, oh, check that out. This is my exhaust valve. You'll see that it's in line with the exhaust port. I can physically touch this thing and know that that is the exhaust valve. Whenever the exhaust starts to open, you need to adjust the intake. It's that simple. So how do you adjust it? I got my feeler gauges here, and this particular setup, I'm just setting it cold here on the stand so that I can roll the engine over a bunch and do whatever I need to do to get the rest of it put back together, and then I'm going to end up starting it. And you always want to set your lash hot because that's whenever the engine's going to be seeing the majority of its time. You need to warm your engine up anyway if you're doing race stuff. So, all right, my exhaust has started down. In this case, I just picked an arbitrary 12 thousandths. The cam card calls for 20. I know that it's going to grow some. I've got an aluminum block and I've got an aluminum cylinder head, but I've got a steel push rod and a steel lifter. So the head is going to outgrow the push rod, therefore I'm going to get more lash. So 12 thousandths, I'm going to insert this in here, and you'll notice that it's got just a little drag. Just a little bit of drag. It does have enough drag on it that it'll hold the feeler gauge if I leave it sitting there. You don't want to have to fight it, but you also don't want it floppy, right? Because then it's not 12 thousandths. So this is a perfect example of what it should look like. It's really hard to teach somebody how to use a feeler gauge without being able to actually let them feel it. But for the most part, you should be able to slip it in and out of there with, you know, some drag, but nothing excessive. You shouldn't have to force it, and you also shouldn't have it falling out. The way you adjust is with your wrench here. I'm doing this backwards so you guys can see everything. But let's just say I took a round off of that adjuster nut. So now you see I've got a lot of lash here, like that's loosey goosey. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to adjust down until I just start to feel the drag, just start to see it moving. I'm going to go ahead and pull my feeler gauge out and hold the T-handle here so that I can come around and lock this nut down. So I'll run it up with my fingers, and then I'm putting a little backwards pressure on the T-handle, and I'm actually pushing forward on the wrench here so that I can make sure that it locks in the right spot. If you just reef it down, sometimes the adjuster will move with it, and then you want the right amount of lash. All right, so what I always will do is, if you don't have that nifty tool that's specifically for adjusting lash that has the torque wrench built into the handle, and it's a through bolt deal, so your T-handle can go through and you can just quickly lock them all down. They're super nice. I don't have one. I'm not that guy. What I do have is a regular old torque wrench. So once I get these things set where I want, I'll just go down the line and just torque them all up. No big deal. So we've got the intake set. Now we're going to keep rolling around. Exhaust is on its way down. Exhaust is going to come all the way back up. All right, so the intake started down right there. But you don't want to adjust it when the intake's down. Remember, our acronym is EOIC. So exhaust opening, you do the intake. Intake closing, you do the exhaust. Well, what does intake closing mean? Intake closing means when we have gone to peak lift and we have started back the other way, right about there. So we're on the way up. We're about halfway up. Maybe not halfway, a third of the way up. Now, definitely in the right spot for my exhaust. So I'll check it. Perfect. I don't have to force it, but I can feel a little bit of drag whenever I roll that feeler gauge in there. So that is how you set lash. I'm not going to go through doing an exhaust again because you already saw me do the intake. All you have to do is run through the entire engine. For the first time that you do this, a lot of times I will just row really quickly. I'll just, whichever one I see doing what I want it to do, I'll just roughly lash it. And then that's when I'm on the stand. And then what I'll do from there is I'll go back through it and I'll follow the firing order. So basically what you can know is going to happen is if the exhaust starts to open, you can adjust the intake on 1. And then if it's an LS, then the next thing that's going to happen is the exhaust is going to start to open on 8, and then 7, and then 2, and then 6, and then 5, 4, 3. So you're going to be able to follow the firing order in order to quickly run through your lash. As soon as you do all of the intakes, then you come back, and then now the same thing is going to happen. When you get to your intake is on its closing, so you can adjust the exhaust on number 1, the next one will be 8, 7, 2, 6, 5, 4, 3. It's really quick. The cool part is if you got this thing in the car, and I can do that if there's enough interest in this video, if you have it in the car, then all you have to do from there is run through the firing order. And it makes it really easy if you put yourself a little button like on the firewall or something where you can bump the button. And you've probably seen this if you ever watched racing videos and saw guys in the pits doing this and just didn't know what they were doing. They'll hit the starter button, obviously with the car in neutral or on jack stands or anything, but you hit the button and you can just bump the motor over with the starter until you see it do what you want it to do, and then you adjust the other valve. It's super simple. There's a little bit of mystification that has come around this. I've kind of felt like that is unwarranted. It's not that hard. And the other part of this is if your valvetrain's stable, you shouldn't be adjusting this all the time. You don't have to adjust this all the time. I'm going to be totally honest with you. There's a GSP car that I need to do a video on. It's a Pro-Charged small block Ford, and it's got a solid valvetrain in it. It turns 8,000 plus RPM pretty much every time he starts the car up. And that thing, I don't remember the last time I adjusted it. It's been over a year. Now, that's maybe a little excessive. I like to at least get inside and check it all out. And we're going to do that soon because I'm actually working on the intake for that car. That's a little side note for later. But you don't have to adjust on these things once a week. They're not carburetors. That's an EFI joke for you guys. So set it and forget it. 6 months down the road, say when the weather changes pretty significantly, that's a good time to, just go in, pop your valve covers off. Truth be told, if you have a valvetrain that's exotic enough to be a solid roller and turn 8,000 plus RPM, it probably would be a really good idea to get in there and just inspect some things every now and then, because when you lean on stuff, bad things can happen. We try not to make that happen, but it's good to keep an eye on it. All right, I've already been talking for too long. I'm going to wrap this thing up. But that's a quick intro into solid roller valve trains. Don't be scared of them. The main thing is having the adjustability in the system. If you don't have adjustment anywhere, like say you're using a stock LS rocker arm with a solid lifter and obviously a solid push rod, well, then things get a little funky because you have no way to adjust your lash and you need to be able to adjust it. Can you get specific push rods to do that? Yes. Is it cost effective or time efficient? Absolutely not. There is one alternative that I'm aware of that is pretty decent. I haven't used it yet, maybe someday, because I am a fan of the LS rocker arm. That stock rocker arm is a good rocker arm, and even some of the derivations from aftermarket companies, it's a good rocker arm. It's good, it's light. Is the Comp XDA push rods, and this isn't a brag for them. Like I said, I've not used it, but it is pretty cool because it's a 2-piece push rod, or technically 3-piece, because you have a base for the push rod, and you have a shim pack for the push rod, and then you have a top for the push rod, and that shim pack can be adjusted in length. So you effectively have an adjustable length push rod. It's a little tedious. It's extremely tedious if you have a shaft mount setup where you have to pull the entire shaft off to get the push rods out. That would take a minute. But again, if it's all stable, once you set it, you should be able to forget it for at least a little while. And then when you come back and check it, the thing you should expect to see is just roll through and check all your lash on what you got, and it should be right. If you find that one of them is 30 thousandths off, something is killed. The lifter's killed, the push rod's killed, the rocker cup's killed, something is hurt, the tip is hurt. Take it apart. There's no reason for that kind of excessive lash. If you find that they're 1 or 2 out, decide for yourself if you feel like you should even adjust it for 1 or 2 thousandths. If they're 5 thousandths, adjust it and then check it again quickly to make sure that it's not continually growing and getting worse, right? If you run something and you have to adjust it 5 thousandths, and then a week later you have to adjust another 5, and then another week later you have to adjust another 5, there's a part that's dying a slow death. You need to take your system apart and figure out where it's coming from. Last thing, on this LS stuff, I've already had a snafu with this particular engine of not getting the push rod in the cup of the lifter. So if you're ever adjusting a valve train at all, and you have adjustable rockers, and you have one rocker arm that the adjuster nut, the cup to the nut is not in the right place, like it's sticking way out or it's way deep, stop. Something is wrong. You should be able to look down the entire row of adjusters, and they should look about the same the whole way down. Unless you have something weird going on, like you're using different length push rods, which in that case, all your intakes should look like one thing and all your exhaust should look like another. If you get into a situation where you don't know why on earth the adjusters are the wrong length and it's sticking way out or something, the push rod's probably not in the cup. You need to stop and take it apart and figure out what's going on. I think that is enough jawing for this video. It's going to already be way longer than I actually expected it to be. I really appreciate it if you made it this far. I hope that this is helpful to you. I hope that this inspires people to go out and build some really cool stuff, because honestly, solid roller valve trains are awesome. Solid flat tappet is awesome. Solid is just in general awesome because it usually means you're doing high RPM things, and I am absolutely a high RPM junkie, and you better believe that I am aiming for 9,000 plus with this thing whenever I finally get it back together. It's going to be great. Till next time, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, leave me a comment, all that good stuff. And by the way, feel free to tell me some stuff too that you want to see in the future, because I'm always trying to look for some stuff. I am going to hub dyno a super powerful nitrous S10 pickup truck that I will be introducing to the channel. That's been a long time GSP customer, and he is going to the next level with this thing. And so we're going to hub dyno that thing this coming week, and that's going to obviously make it onto the channel. It's going to be awesome, and can't wait to bring that to you. I'm literally going to stop talking right now. Peace out.